Buongiorno a tutti, benvenuti, welcome Rembrandt and welcome Stefano. Vi ringrazio per essere presenti, sono molto emozionata oggi perché veramente i nostri ospiti sono illustrissimi ospiti, come si dice. Però lascio i saluti al professor Fabrizio Tucci, che è il direttore del Dipartimento di Pianificazione, Design e Tecnologia dell'Architettura, nonché past coordinator del dottorato di omonimo, che ha appunto 3 curricula, tra cui uno in design, un tra quello di tecnologia dell'architettura, appunto in pianificazione. Tra l'altro, professor Tucci, ci sono studenti di tutti i dottorati coinvolti di Sapienza, quindi diciamo una platea come dire, di interlocutori di tutto rispetto, nonché molti studenti che ringrazio per essere presenti. A te la parola, grazie.
Molte grazie Sabrina. Allora, innanzitutto un grazie speciale agli organizzatori, a voi organizzatori di questo evento importante, appunto Sabrina Lucibello, il direttore di Saperi & Co, il professore associato del Dipartimento PDTA che ho l'onore di dirigere, e Carmen Rotondi, dottoranda del dottorato PDTA, per l'appunto facente parte, come ha appena detto Sabrina, del nostro stesso Dipartimento. Si tratta della seconda tappa del percorso di riflessione intrapreso sul tema Biovision the future, per approfondire le traiettorie verso le quali il futuro sta evolvendo sempre più rapidamente, su come l'approccio progettuale su cui noi lavoriamo da sempre possa essere un utile strumento per trovare risposte concrete. In particolare si tratta di una sicuramente interessantissima, lo sarà, lecture critica a 2 voci, quelle d'eccezione dell'architetto e designer Stefano Marzano e del microbiologo scienziato Leon Brand, il cui confronto riguarderà come focus il futuro del nostro pianeta e quello di tutti noi, con l'obiettivo di stimolare una riflessione progettuale e strategica verso approcci sempre più olistici, interdisciplinari e, diciamo, lo possiamo dire virgolettato, preventivi in prospettiva post-antropocentrica. Ci stiamo riflettendo tutti insieme da molto tempo su questa problematica e su questa visione. E a proposito di visione centrale, in particolare la visione, la tensione, mi sembra di poter dire, in questo contesto, verso il rafforzamento del carattere infradisciplinare della ricerca e della sperimentazione, guardando nella sua evoluzione a quello che noi ci auspichiamo che oggi viene definito infradisciplinary approach, un approccio che spinge chi governa lo sviluppo del progetto e della ricerca a muoversi nei confini tra le discipline. Peraltro i nostri stessi padri hanno sempre ricercato confini molto allettanti dal punto di vista, proficui dal punto di vista per l'appunto della ricerca e della sperimentazione. Quindi una visione che cerca di andare oltre una collaborazione semplice, fra virgolette semplice, integrazione di saperi, per la quale si parla di multidisciplinarità, oltre un profondo scambio di punti di vista scientifici e una sintesi per la quale si parla di interdisciplinarità, ma anche una prova di interazione osmotica, quello che accadrà sicuramente oggi, esercitata dai luoghi tutti da esplorare posti nei limiti o nei punti di contatto, dipende dai punti di vista, infradiscipline. E mi piace sottolineare in questo senso che il seminario e il successivo workshop sono aperti, oltre che al dottorato del nostro Dipartimento PDTA, anche a 5 altri dottorati, quelli di automatica, bioingegneria e ricerca operativa APRO, del Dipartimento di Ingegneria Informatica, Automatica e Gestionale Antonio Ruberti, quello di biologia ambientale ed evoluzionistica del Dipartimento di Biologia Ambientale, quello di ingegneria elettrica, dei materiali e delle nanotecnologie del Dipartimento di Ingegneria Astronautica, Elettrica ed Energetica, quello di psicologia sociale, dello sviluppo e della ricerca educativa del Dipartimento di Psicologia dei processi di sviluppo e socializzazione e quello di genetica e biologia molecolare del Dipartimento di Biologia e Biotecnologie Charles Darwin. Dunque, sono veramente molto contento di questa iniziativa, ancora i miei più profondi complimenti e un caloroso augurio a tutti voi di buon lavoro.
Grazie Fabrizio, grazie davvero. E allora iniziamo questa giornata, poi parleremo un po' in inglese, quindi sarà un training anche per tutti i ragazzi che sono della triennale in particolare, prendetelo come un pre-esame di inglese dell'idoneità. L'evento di oggi è dunque una seconda tappa, come ha detto appunto il collega Fabrizio Tucci, del ciclo Biovision of the Future, che è un percorso di ricerca intrapreso e di riflessione critica insieme a Stefano Marzano sulle questioni riguardanti la nascente rivoluzione biologica e soprattutto sulla sfida progettuale che il design deve essere in grado di cogliere proprio per definire nuovi modelli sostenibili e anche desiderabili del prossimo futuro. Siamo infatti in grado di governare oggi un livello scientifico molto sofisticato, ma probabilmente la domanda è proprio questa, e questo intorno a cui riflettiamo, non siamo ancora in grado di comprenderne appieno le ricadute etiche, sociali, soprattutto nei risultati che stiamo raggiungendo. Il design dunque è ingaggiato in una sfida culturale ancora prima che tecnologica. E quindi dover rivolgersi a questi temi che tanto oggi sentiamo essere attuali, come per esempio in particolare quello dell'ecologia, immaginando prospettive futuri di cambiamento, scenari di cambiamento sistemico verso futuri che siano appunto anche, che considerino anche l'altra faccia della medaglia, cioè le distopie che da questo possono nascere. Il primo evento che si è svolto ad ottobre ha quindi tracciato, come dire, una mappa geopolitica della natura, in cui le istanze sociali, etiche, ecologiche sono fortemente interconnesse tra di loro. L'immagine che ne è emersa, abbiamo detto che abbiamo proprio coniato, diciamo, questo termine, usato questo termine, è un nuovo rinascimento, che cerca di avventurarsi nel futuro utilizzando strumenti che prima d'ora non erano forse stati mai così fortemente presi in considerazione, come per esempio la cura, la prevenzione, l'anticipazione, la condivisione e la significazione. Il design, che è appunto strumento sintesi spesso tra le discipline, è quindi chiamato veramente a confrontarsi con questa natura così complessa e contraddittoria del fenomeno e ad assumere un approccio sperimentale che sia in grado quindi anche di autocorreggersi, quindi non avere la scienza infusa, come si dice, ma veramente cogliere il senso più profondo della disciplina, quindi il progettare, il poter modificare per portare, come dire, un beneficio nella vita di tutti noi, perché è questo il vero scopo del design. Siamo dunque oggi ad approfondire insieme a Stefano Marzano Architetto quali possono essere le traiettorie verso cui il futuro si sta evolvendo. Ci presenteranno e parleremo di co-emerging futures, e vedremo quelli che sono i flussi di cambiamento che sono tutt'oggi in atto, come per esempio driver sociali, che riguardano driver sociali, driver economici, driver tecnologici. Questi flussi sono guidati in particolare da alcune narrative emergenti che alimentano in particolare 4 futuri emergenti. Poi noi ne analizzeremo nel nostro futuro workshop, uno in particolare. L'evento introduce quindi una prossima fase, che è quella del workshop che vi ho anticipato, di cui poi la bravissima Carmen Rotondi vi racconterà alla fine i dettagli, e che sarà un workshop che, come ha annunciato il direttore del Dipartimento, coinvolgerà più dottorati di Sapienza, con l'obiettivo quindi di stimolare proprio questa riflessione strategica. Quindi voglio lasciare assolutamente la parola, sono curiosa e veramente ansiosa di capire che cosa ne pensano i nostri ospiti, in particolare Stefano Marzano, che è architetto e designer, che si è laureato al Politecnico di Milano, dove ha anche insegnato, come anche alla Domus Academy, ma in particolare lo ricordiamo perché è stato fondamentale guida CEO di Philips Design e anche del centro design della Philips, nonché ha lavorato in Electrolux, è stato nominato dall'European Design Leadership Board membro di questa importante organizzazione, e nel 2005, pensate, è stato addirittura nominato da Business Week come uno dei 38 best leader globali, quindi che veramente ci riempie di gioia averlo qui, anche perché in particolare ha ricevuto la laurea honoris causa in Sapienza qualche anno or sono. E poi Rembrandt, che invece è un biologo molecolare, che si è dottorato presso l'Università di Cape Town, un virologo, quindi insomma pienamente funzionale oggi a immaginare quali possono essere i futuri dopo veramente l'evento pandemico che ci ha sconvolto, ed è stato Director of Design Research presso Philips Design ed è attualmente Senior Director Foresight and Social Cultural Trends, sempre presso Philips Design. La sua ricerca fornisce ispirazione e guida per iniziative di indagine futura, innovazione e creazione di valore. Tra le sue pubblicazioni principali con Philips Design ricordiamo Rethinking Value in Changing Landscape del 2010, scritto con Simona Rocchi, Co-Emerging Futures, a model for reflecting of streams of future change del 2019. Let's now switch to the English language. You'll have subtitles, and let's pass the ball to Stefano Marzano. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. I'm glad that there will be subtitles, so I can understand also what I'm saying. Indeed, let's go back to 4 months ago, when actually we had the first meeting and the first conference on the subject. There have I lost? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, Stefano.
Okay, very good. 4 months ago, we had a discussion on the climate change and the pandemic. In 4 months, another challenge has come, the war in Europe, in Ukraine. So if we talk about, we start from the present to move then later on the discussion about the future. Climate change is the real major challenge that our world society is facing. But it seems that for about 70 years after Second World War, we have been gradually entering in a kind of lethargy and in a kind of winter sleep, as all the call to take action to address climate change and to repair some of the effect that the 200 years of industrialization have created with the impact of our actions and our way of living generated on the global scale on our home have not been taken with the appropriate consideration. So the impact on the world has been the result of mistakes done with a benign intention to create prosperity, to create progress, and sometimes have been also created misusing the environment and misusing solutions that were found in order to create progress, welfare, and well-being. This in the spirit of an anthropocentric society, where actually I strongly believe that technology would have been feeding progress, and progress would have been feeding continuously growth, and that would have been the path for the future. I believe that the pandemic, it has been a kind of shock wave that has started to remove a bit of the lethargy and the winter sleep, and has clearly indicated that a pandemic, a virus, doesn't recognize any border, doesn't belong just to a part of the earth, but actually it is a concern of a global community. And in order to address transformation in a way that can be directed toward a desired future, we need indeed to engage a global community. With the pandemic, we have, in a sense, rediscovered or put a bit more emphasis on collaboration. And collaboration not only within one country, but indeed we have realized that the collaboration had to go beyond the national boundaries, trying to actually maximizing the use of expertise, knowledge around the world in order to address this incredible challenge. And in a sense, it started also to revert a trend that in the last 20 years was picking up in terms of revamping interest in individualization. We have seen the discussions in the political arena by many politicians about leaving the European Union, changing again from euro to a local currency, and the pandemic has, in a sense, put some different thinking. The acceleration of this has come also with the war, and it has been another shock wave that 4 months ago was unthinkable, and has given us another push to actually take a deep consideration about the relevance of collaboration, the relevance of being united in order to be stronger and more capable to deal with the future challenge. Unfortunately, not the global society is sharing the same thoughts. And this is the challenge that we have also about our ability to aim to a future that definitely will provide a benefit for an ecosystem of which we are all part, and will give us the opportunity to maximize collaboration and to maximize all the forces that in our society would be really able to contribute. We have seen a number of things that didn't happen earlier, and specifically the mistrust that our society would have been capable of changing behavior. And pandemic has proven that people have been capable to adopt a different behavior, working from home and having a different way to relate with the community, and accepting or exploring ways of living that were only discussed at the theoretical level before the pandemic happened. And nowadays we see that many of the things that we have experienced in a kind of prototyping of new life have a number of advantages that we would like eventually to maintain, reduce the effort and reduce the pressure on mobility, taking advantage of remote working, focusing on the use of advanced technology to reduce mobility and traveling. So a lot of things that can actually contribute to a potential change, and having created an evidence out of which we can derive some learning. During the first meeting we had, I was also captured by one comment of Mr. Poli, a futurologist, who also mentioned about the concurrency of different futures. And indeed, we will address later with Rayon Brand the concurrent future that we will discuss. He said that the most relevant aspect was acceleration. And acceleration is indeed quite dramatic if we consider that the UN has declared that the climate change is at a point of almost no return, and whatever actually the action will be that we will be capable to take will not actually have impact on immediate terms, but on a longer term. It means that we will have to develop a lot of stamina and develop a lot of collaborative effort in our global society. The war has added another element into this, has given an indication of the ability of a community to drastically change their life. Of course, due to the effect of external actions, the Russian invasion. However, we have seen a behavior of people that was, in a sense, unprecedented. Women and children leaving the country, but men, professors, teachers, technologists, workers, changing by overnight what they were doing to turn to be defender of their home. Well, I think that this does represent perhaps a small example of what actually the change in climate is demanding. Not a small progressive little actions, but it really demands to embrace a strong action that will give us the energy to make an effort in changing our behavior, not as radically as happened in the situation of Ukraine, but clearly understanding that we have to adopt different measures, different way of living. We have to look into a different way to our current life, because we have to protect our house, and our house is the earth, and there is no a second one. And definitely, I don't think that the vision to go to Mars and to explore other place to live that currently are desert is very much attractive. In this, one of the major challenge is, of course, the ability to look at a desirable future as a future that is ecocentric in a sense, an ecosystem centric that will be capable to maintain a sustainable life for nature, for people, for all the spaces, living spaces that are on Earth. And this demands indeed collaboration, first of all, of course, at political level, at economic level, and at technological level, and so on. It is a requirement without which we will probably not be able to succeed in this major challenge. Clearly, into this, design has also a role, and we all have a role. We have a role as individual, as citizens, by expressing our view through our vote, political position, by expressing what actually is the desire of the desirable future that we would like to see happen. And the other, as a professional, as a citizen in our life, to actually work, to participate, to shape, or to give a direction to the future with our own actions. The future that we will discuss later with Rayon are futures and not scenarios. It means that actually we can see among this future the one that we think is more desirable, but scenarios will actually develop, and we'll see different elements of the different future interacting with each other and demanding on a continuous basis to think about the way in which we can create and generate solutions that will be capable to redirect the scenarios toward the direction of the desired final ambition. The role of design has to take a different direction than the one that has taken 30 years ago into the corporate world. And I've been part of this direction. I also focused very much the design process on people, on the centrality of people, creating a multidisciplinary approach, already thinking that the need of the collaborative effort of all disciplines and skills, knowledge would have been very relevant, based on research and based on evidence proof, and integrated into the business. Now, the culture of corporate design during the last 30 years has not changed very much. And in a sense, during the last 13 years have more focused on the emphasis on the how more than the why. And the mediatic power of America has created the focus and the buzzword on design thinking, that very much focused on the methodology, the how you do it. And in a sense is commoditizing, giving the impression that simply following education on design thinking, it will be sufficient to perform as design community, and not only as design community, but also as people that do participate in the creation of value, that by following this probably will actually do what is right. And this is not the case, as we have to reconsider that there is the need to focus on the why. Why are we going to focus on the solutions that will be directed on the ecosystem, and what actually is the objective? As we as designer will be able to synthesize the convergence of the collaborative effort, and what we can try to do is the one to create solutions and go beyond the solution to also understand what the possible negative consequences of our solution are, understanding what the dystopia are, and trying to develop strategies to minimize the risks that these solutions created with the intended beneficial objective might create. Another thing is very important into this is to understand that humanity is indeed like a coin. Humanity has a good face of the coin, but there's also a negative face of the coin, a good and evil. When actually in the 90s, internet was created and actually appeared into our daily life, as it was created much earlier, no one was really very much concerned about cybercrime, about all the consequences on privacy, security that this new technology would have created. So all the solutions that the industry with the benign intention have created have been, in a sense, not considering that there is a part of humanity that is looking at the same solutions and the same technology to exploit them and misuse them for the interest of some individual on the past. And this, I believe, is a great concern. The great concern is that we are not infallible. So we are not, when thinking about solution, even with a benign intent, we might make mistakes. And the last 200 years of industrialization has led where we are today, and this proves that some error have been made. And we have also to consider that there is a part of humanity and a society that doesn't have the same benign intent that we have. Therefore, design can actually be a strategy to minimize risks. And by doing this, we'll actually give in any future that at the end, our society will search an opportunity to create a benefit that will definitely be of advantage of our future society. From a perspective of doing things fast, and Francesco Morace in his participation was saying quick and deep. So doing things and creating alternative scenarios and alternative solutions to minimize risk and having impact on time to a solution to climate change, and also on the economy, creating the opportunity to reduce the number of investment that we have to do to fix the error that we have been creating in the past and that we might also create in the future. So in this, I believe that design can take a new leadership in extending a creation and innovation process by stopping at the moment of the identified solution. And when I say so, including all our current processes of prototyping, testing, evaluation, but going further in actually developing the dystopia scenarios and taking an action also against the evil side of humanity, thinking how our ideas, our solutions might be misused, and in which way we can anticipate and we can provide a level of security that will give a peace of mind, possibly for our society. So, having said so, I think it is interesting to start to listen the presentation of Rayon about the 4 concurrent future, and start to interact on this. And of course, it will not be only an interaction between Rayon and myself, but it will be very interesting and very good if the interaction will be extended to all the ones that are also following us and share their view. Thank you, Sabrina. Can we give the word to Rayon?
Yes, I pass the ball to Rayon.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to participate in this initiative. I find it super interesting. I've looked at the roadmap that you've created for the way forward. So I'm really happy to make a small contribution and to participate. So I will share with you today, like Stefano said, the co-emerging future studies that I've done. And this study, was enabled, by time that Philips Design gave me to do the study, which I'm really grateful for. But the study was not only done for Philips. It was a study sort of like really looking outside, looking at the world, and then anybody or any stakeholder can ask, what does this mean for me? So I'm going to start to share the slides. And I've discussed with Stefano, I will stop at sort of like certain intervals in the presentation so we can have a little bit of discussion, see if there are questions or things to discuss. So we make it a little bit more interactive, and then I will proceed. Also, one thing is I did not attend the previous interaction, so I don't know what was already shared. And there's, especially in the beginning of my slides, maybe there are things you say, oh, well, we've heard this already. Please bear with me. So I will try not to elaborate too much, or if you think I do, just raise your hand, say, tell me, move on. That's also okay. So let me share my screen. Everybody sees my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Yes.
Okay. So let's start straight away. There's something here that, yeah. So as Stefano mentioned, about more than 10 years ago, in 2010, we did a study, Simona Rocchi and myself, called Rethinking Value in a Changing Landscape, and we were in Philips Design. And we were looking much more from a socioeconomic development perspective to see how the notion of companies creating value for people is changing over time. And it was with a view of sort of like also reflecting on the way that we innovate in the company, etc. And we sort of like identified that the world through its development and its material development has shifted through these different paradigms. People have moved from the agricultural settings to big and growing cities with the advent of the industrial paradigm. And the industrial paradigm, like you know, came about when we could start to mass produce things and goods, and people moved to the cities to modernize their lives and to raise their standard of living. The experience paradigm that followed is because people lost a little bit of identity when they moved to densely populated cities, and experience brands saw the opportunity to give aspirational lifestyle stories that people bought into, and that fueled another wave of consumption. And you know, if we look at this, it's also clear, you know, that the economic systems that we've created to move this forward is very much dependent on sort of like consumption and growth. And this is sort of like the system that sort of like shifted the world economy forward. We had then the rise of like the knowledge paradigm, which created platforms that people could use to create and share their own value. And the transformation paradigm, we foresaw at that time that companies would start to shift more and more, the leading companies, towards joining forces with government, with NGOs, and start to take ownership of like remaining key issues in the world, you know, and focus their business goals and their business visions around that. So as we have progressed through these like waves of material pursuit and material progress, we also realized that through this whole process, we have calculated the cost of production, the cost of distribution, we've calculated the customer value, but we, to a large extent, failed to build in the cost to the environment. You know, that was never priced in, also never priced into the solutions that we created. And we've sort of like built up a debt to the environment. So much so that the last ice age ended about 10 to 12,000 years ago. And that allowed agricultural, people to move from hunter-gatherers to agricultural settings. Towns started to grow, agriculture started to grow. It was a benign period of benign climatic conditions that allowed civilizations to flourish. But our activities, you know, have shifted now clearly us into a new geological epoch. And it's the first time in the history of the planet, and the planet has been through many epochs, that one species is predominantly responsible for shifting and tilting the planet into a new epoch called the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene will be earmarked, and is, you know, we are facing a global warming, rapid environmental decline, and it is actually made worse with poor global governance. So we are facing possible disruptions that are becoming more and more evident. Also, as Stefano's mentioned, that will threaten human civilization. It will threaten our planetary ecosystems, and it can have existential consequences for all life. So it's a pretty serious picture. And so you've heard, you know, I think much of, you know, the statistics in the background, but this is the picture of a 1.1 degree raise in the climate of the planet. The climate started to rise in the late 1800s, and since 1975, it's really accelerating because of the amount of CO2 also to be released in the environment. So, you know, we have bleaching of coral reefs, environmental destruction, mass migration, especially around coastal regions, storms are increasing in strength, etc., etc. So the problem is also in end of 2015, it was the Paris Climate Accord, and it was agreed that we need to dramatically reduce carbon release into the atmosphere. You can see this is the annual climate CO2 emissions from 1940 to 2021 in billions of tons of CO2 released. And we have now reached new records of in 2018 and 19, 37 billion tons of CO2 released. In 2015, and this is where this line indicates, it was, you know, agreed in the Paris Climate Accord that we need to reduce our CO2 released into the atmosphere by 45% in 2030, and to zero carbon released in 2050. And in that, since that period, the carbon has just continued, the release has just continued to rise. We are not really making any progress. So we are not going to be able to stick to the 1.5 degrees centigrade that is the danger limit of tipping the planet into irreversible change. So it is pretty drastic that we have to start to look at how we design, how we consume, how we live, and how we interact with the planet. Now, just for you to realize, and probably you know that already, in the history of our planet is 4.5 billion years old. In the last 500 million years, there's been 5 major extinction events. And in the Permian event, in the middle, 96% of all life on the planet perished. And it was due to CO2 release, due to volcanic eruptions or an asteroid impact. It's still not sure. Runaway global warming, changing ocean currents, ocean acidification, and a global ecosystem collapse. So we, in the last 200 years, have simulated that event. You know, we are starting to simulate that event. We are basically doing all those same things. And we have already entered the 6th extinction. The species are now disappearing at more than 1,000 times the background rate that was evident during the Holocene period. So, you know, we are already doing these things, and there's 9 active tipping points that scientists are monitoring. You know, I'm not going to go through all of them, but all of them have been already severely compromised, you know, and we don't know how far we are from tipping points. So, you know, this is the level of seriousness. So my reflection in 2019, when I did an update of the future study. So the future study that I do are not like trends, you know, that are a more short-term cycle. I think, you know, every 10 years, if you take a big view, it gives you the opportunity to act on that view, you know. So for me, futures is sort of like 1% analyzing and understanding, and you know, 99% is sort of like really activating and engaging and disseminating and getting people to understand and act on those futures. Now, in the past, you know, we were making sense of the future, firstly, more from an individual point of view. You know, in the industrial age, you had like future visionaries based on more like industrialized visions to inspire society to, you know, to take a certain direction. It became more sophisticated and more inclusive. We had preferable future scenarios, trends, and sophisticated techniques, causal layer analysis, spiral dynamics that really sort of like weave together a lot of sort of like influences in society to look at more societal perspective of making sense of the future. But I thought that, you know, all of these methodologies that we've been using were largely anthropocentric. All of them are based on bringing humans together, put like a human view and say like, what do we as humans want? And nobody, you know, nature never had a voice. So if we go to a post-anthropocentric future, we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we give nature a voice? It is also becoming clear, you know, in our pursuit of fulfilling human needs and aspirations, you know, we have caused an incredible amount of destruction, and probably we have to accept that we cannot fulfill all human needs. And for sure, you know, we cannot afford to continue to create artificial aspirations to fuel consumption. The other thing is that, you know, if we start to think about value creation, we cannot only think about creating value for humans, because we share this planet, you know, with a multitude of species. So if we put the ecosystem at the center, we have to start, or at least create one future trajectory where we say, you know, we have to think of the value for the ecosystem first before we think of the value for humans or human needs, and putting the ecosystem really in the center of things. So that was a little bit sort of like the idea that I had. But then I thought also, you know, like Stefano said, not everybody has the same view of the future. And, you know, I was intrigued to go back to say, but why do we have these different views of the future? Where does it come from? And before I go there, so I will get there soon. I also want to talk about one other thing. We have been, since the Enlightenment, and especially after the French Revolution, we have, created this sort of like arrow of time metaphor of time perception, how we perceive time. We are constantly short of time. So it's all fueled by our belief in constant progress. And that belief was not always there. It's quite recent. It's when we started to develop, like in the Enlightenment, like a really scientific and industrial capability, and we sort of like focus more on individual freedom, we were on this sort of like track towards like progress, thinking of past, present, and future. And that, pushes us in a certain way, and it causes us to think in a certain way. But this is not a universal way in the world of seeing time. There's, for example, the Amundawa tribe in the Amazon that was studied by an anthropologist, and they found out that they do not have in their vocabulary or their language a construct for the arrow of time or past, present, and future. Everything is woven into what is. So they don't have this construct, and they talk and they see their interaction with their environment in a very, very different way. So the chronological perception of time that we are all basically that shapes the way that we see the world, and we see also how to innovate, is a cognitive linguistic construct. It is basically embedded in our language, and this causes us to think in a certain way. If you look at sort of like traditional Eastern cultures, there's a much more cyclical perception of time. So I will explain this a little bit later. So and then Einstein with space-time said that, okay, time is not something on its own. Time can move backwards and forwards, and time is completely entangled with space. Space-time is like an entangled unity, and it's relative. So what happens, like, if we sort of like expand the way of seeing time, how will it change our thinking? So, and this is just, I'm just putting this because for me it was triggering, because I think also the way that we approach innovation and approach design is predominantly from the perspective of progress in chronological time. And I think it's interesting to sort of like open that up. And if you look, in chronological time, it's all about time management, fear of losing out, existential angst, time running out, deterministic vision, narrow goals, time is money, efficiency, need for speed. It's all of these things that drives us forward and drives us to innovate and to act and to behave in a certain way. If we think of cyclical time, like, in China, for example, still in contemporary Chinese culture, astrology, like the 12 years, of like the year of the rat or the year of, all of these things are incredibly important. It really shapes sort of like people's social interactions, how they see the world. There's like the carbon and nitrogen cycles, there's the climate cycles, the seasons, our circadian rhythms, So you could also move away from the chronological perspective and just see sort of like the rhythms of nature as something that exists and has a certain rhythm. And you can go beyond that, like Buddhism, that sees nirvana. It just sees like the planet and space as a continuum that is completely interconnected and entangled, very much similar to quantum theory. There's quite interesting similarities between the beliefs of Buddhism, the certain aspects of the beliefs of Buddhism that see this sort of like continuity of everything, and quantum theory that was developed much later, And Niels Bohr, who was basically one of the creators of quantum theory, recognized this very much. He was completely intrigued by these parallels that we took 2,000 years to discover something that was already described, but from a more spiritual perspective, like thousands of years ago. So you have, and this is, I think, much more looking at a world that is emergent, is constantly changing, is constantly flowing, and looking at the interaction and looking at relationships. The relational time is all how things relate and how those relationships shift and change and build over time, rather than thinking in terms of like linear progress. So this is just sort of like for some reflection. Let's see, with us thinking how the model that we had in 2010 evolved. So the first thing we see is that much of, you know, the model of the progression of these waves of value that we describe was created to some extent by modernism, a belief in science and technology, a belief in progress moving us forward. You know, with the emergence of postmodernism, you know, it was not only about logic and reason, but it was also, it started to learn from, I think, Eastern cultures by valuing subjectivity. So emotions, experience, as much as reason and logic. You know, so it started to sort of like create a different balance. It also started to move away. Modernism was always looking for the ultimate, the one truth that science can prove. This is the truth, you know, so it's like a very sort of like an absolute kind of like way of thinking, whereas postmodernism, based on your experience, there can be multiple views of the truth. That is also, has a kind of like a dark side in our modern context, because and this also gave rise to like phenomenology and all of these sort of like philosophical ways of seeing the world. But in the knowledge age, it also it clashed with, you know, algorithms that guides our behavior in the online world. So, for example, the idea of multiple truths and my subjective truth is as valid as your subjective truth. Algorithms, you know, if you do a search on Google and I do a search on Google, we get completely different results. And the reason is these algorithms try to understand you, and it tries to give you more from what you of what you already believe in. So it traps you into kind of like a bubble of self-confirmation. And you see sort of like also in the COVID pandemic, the vaxxers and the anti-vaxxers, you see conservative, liberal, you know, all of these things are sort of like, you know, trapped in bubbles of self-confirmation that split the societal thinking. So in how we now react on this sort of like global challenge is that, you know, depending on where you are coming from, it splits into a number of different directions. The first split is basically, there's a direction which I called, it's based on the augmentative mindset. It means like really a belief in classical science and technology, that will augment us, make us stronger, and we can actually transform ourselves and transform well, change ourselves, change the environment around us. And I call it the transmutation direction, because we just believe we can use technology to safeguard us no matter what happens to the planet. Technology will give us some answers to respond to that. That's the one belief, and it's fueling that direction. The transformation is more a preventative mindset, is realizing our dependencies on the planetary systems, and that we have to, like Stefano said also, start to reflect on our behavior, start to reflect on what we have to do and how we have to act. Obviously, that is also leading to like a myriad of like possible scenarios of how you could act and what you could or should do. So, and each of those directions, and in the end, the model, I've looked at the key streams of the future that has already a lot of philosophical, but also economic investment behind it. You know, so these are like strongly emerging directions. At the top and at the bottom, these are sort of like a little bit out of the mainstream. They are the more like younger emerging regions. And the two streams in the middle, I think we recognize because it is more like the two mainstream directions. So let's first look on the transmutation angle. At the top, we have the post-human, post-biological direction. And that direction is basically the belief, and it's rooted in Ray Kurzweil's singularity, that AI and computers will become more intelligent. It will become almost like a more intelligent species than humans. So unless we are able or willing to consider to give up the biological format and merge with this level of intelligence, we will be left behind as a lesser species. And if you look at the human history, what we did to lesser species, you know, it doesn't make people feel very good. So there's this pursuit, and it sounds science fiction, but I will give you sort of like some examples of what's happening there. And it's really because as humans, and especially in the West, we have like a strong sort of like level of sentiocentrism. It means we value sentience, we value intelligence. And it really comes from, I will get to that a little bit later. It comes from sort of like an ancient meme that is driving that. And we believe that, you know, protecting human intelligence at all costs and advancing that is sort of like a direction that we should pursue. And I call this etheria because we will probably, this direction will take us from like the solid biological form to something that is more in the ether eventually. Then superhuman towards transhuman direction is very much what we see around us today. This is like really the mainstream of anthropocentrism, rooted in modernist classical science, using technology to push us forward. And already, I think, you know, if you just think of the mobile phone, the power that it gives you, you know, just to connect to people worldwide, said like already a lot of these technologies have made us much more powerful, but it goes far beyond that. And what we start to see now is like many of these technologies are not accessible to all people. It starts to widen the divide, you know, between people who have access and people who do not have access. And these technologies are increasingly coming closer and even integrated into our bodies. You know, this is like the future direction. And you will have a sort of like a super class of human being that will transcend human capabilities. And, you know, we will use technologies to make us smarter, to make us faster, to make us wealthier, and to make us live as long as possible or even forever. You know, that is like this trajectory. And it's really sort of like rooted in the philosophy of Max Moore, the transhumanist movement that I think started in around 1988 or something. It was launched, and it was really the belief in technology will make us live forever. And there's a lot of investment flowing in that direction, and I call that immortalia. Transformation arm, there's like two different directions. The one that is more mainstream that we recognize, and especially in Europe, I think many government policies is now starting to strengthen our approach to sustainability, and its belief in creating kind of like a steady state and to recycle and to be cautious of how we use our resources. So it's a very resource-centric, and it's valuing sort of like sustainable prosperity. It's also a little bit more egalitarian than the immortalia, and it's basically to create a habitania. So a habitania is where we can live a good quality of life next to and but giving safe spaces for nature to flourish. That is sort of like that view. Regeneration and the eco-entangle view is it was inspired also like Gaia is the Greek goddess personifying the earth and seeing the earth as a whole. And there was also this a book called Gaia by two scientists, Lynn Margulis, who was a biologist, and James Lovelock, who was a chemist, and they looked and they were intrigued by the interaction between the planet and organisms living on the planet, and they've created this like fascinating looking at all this like the nitrogen cycles and all these cycles and how life on planet makes the planet more livable. You know, it's like a constant interaction with the planet, and they almost like describe the planet as a meta-organism rather than life and the dead planet. It's not life on a dead planet, but it's like one organism interacting. So this shift towards like regeneration, eco-entangled, is where we start to realize we cannot just sort of like see ourselves on top of nature, that we are really entangled. Our health and our well-being and our future is entangled with the planet. And we have to change not only how we see the planet or how we behave towards the planet, but how we see ourselves as part of the planet. You know, it requires a change of mind and a change of heart. And it's very different from sustainability, which is more a sort of like a risk mitigation, compliance kind of approach. So I will get back to this more, but the Gaia puts the ecosystem at the front of everything, and it values biodiverse ecosystem, and it puts the needs of the ecosystem first. So, and like Stefano said, it's not scenarios. These are all future directions emerging in parallel, and you can make different scenarios how these will also interact, where there may be clashes between these directions. And also in each of these trajectories, there's different ways also of acting that can be discussed. I will stop soon for the discussion. I just wanted to show you this because I was intrigued like where these sort of like different mindsets came from. So I made this kind of like model called, I call it the flower of memes and meaning. And many of the ideas pushing us forward and, you know, and pushing us into these like different trajectories is coming from ancient memes that we don't even, and ideas that we don't even think about, and we're almost not even aware of them anymore, but they have a profound way of sort of like shaping the way that we think and the way that we see the world. So I map sort of like some of like the key philosophies and religions around the world and the impact that they had on shaping human thinking. So I cannot go into the detail because we don't have time. I just want to basically take some shortcut and explain a little bit that if we look at our sort of like Western classical science and how we use science technology to move forward, it's to a large extent, you know, it started with the Greek philosophers. You know, Aristotle and Plato like really valued human intelligence, and they started to develop the idea of like the body-mind split. Like Plato, like they had disdain for the body because he thinks it's just sort of like a smelly vessel that will disintegrate, but the mind will continue somehow, and the mind kind of became the soul. And a lot of these ideas were also taken on board by Christianity and other religions. You know, and this sort of like a body-mind split, you know, was sort of like kind of like perpetuated. And in the Bible also there's a verse, I think Genesis 1 verses 28, that where God gives humans dominion over all life on earth, you know. And, you know, even if we are not Christian, everybody in the West has this idea that, you know, we are on top of the world, we own land. It's you know, we decide where other species can live and where they cannot live. So it really has put us on top of nature, and it's sort of like cultivated, or it helped to cultivate this utilitarian view, because we own the planet. You know, we can basically use those resources as we see fit. And with the Enlightenment, some of the early scientists already started, you know, with this idea that, you know, Francis Bacon had this idea that we have to conquer nature and bend it to our will, you know. And, you know, this is exactly what we are doing with science technology. Is like we are cheating nature. We are trying to, through a reductionist approach, using logic and using reason and breaking nature into small building blocks, understanding the building blocks and try to reconfigure it, you know, to suit our own purpose. With little regard, you know, for the voice of nature, of course. And then, you know, we've also developed a kind of like a machine metaphor for nature. And since like Democritus said, like the world consists of atoms, and atoms like the smallest at that time, he thought the atom is the smallest unit and it's indivisible. And Copernicus had this sort of like clockwork understanding of how the planets circumvent the sun. We started to have this idea that, you know, the universe works like a clockwork that we can sort of like understand, that we can predict with mathematics, and we can basically reconfigure it to our will and pursue our like really deterministic goals. And that is like the reductionism and materialist sort of like paradigm. If you look at the postmodern view that is rooted to a large extent also in Eastern thinking, it says to us like truth is not absolute. It's not like the absolute pursuit of the ultimate truth like we do in science, in Western science, but truth is a combination of reason and, you know, experience and intuition. And in China also, they basically, if they talk about subjective and objective, they say it's not the same, but it's not different. It's two sides of the same coin. They are equally important, and they associate subjective more with wisdom and objective more with the context. So it's interesting to understand how language shaped the way that we sort of like approach things. And the thinking there is also not that nature is a clockwork. The yin yang tells us like nature is constantly flowing. There's a constant sort of like balancing and rebalancing. Nature is sort of like emergent and constantly changing. Wu Wei is a very important principle in Tao, and it tells us whatever you do, always stay in the flow of nature. And this is how like these cultures have been guided for hundreds and for thousands of years, you know, living in a way that sort of like stay in the flow of nature, that humans are part of nature and the planet is our host. And, you know, this is also like a lot of these ideas have sort of like tempered reductionism. and started to create the postmodern mindset in the West also. And we are increasingly shifting now to something I call relationalism. And that is recognizing that everything is entangled, and it is to one extent also fueled by the Buddhist belief, but also quantum theory, where nature is like entangled relationships that you cannot decipher. There's a new Karen Barad. She wrote a book called A Genteel Realism, I think it's called. She is a quantum physicist, but she is now a philosopher. And she said that, agency, so the ability to make decisions and to understand and to have consciousness is in relationships. It's not in a single entity. We think like everything is in our brain, we decide. But, more and more physicists start to believe also that it's all about how we relate to our environment. And increasingly, the relational view sees us not, and I will come back to that later, as an interbeing, that we are integrally linked to everything in the planet, and the planet should be seen as a meta-organism of which we are part. And another thing is that when we design, if you take also design thinking, to a large extent, it follows like the reductionist approach. Like we identify a problem, we basically think of like some scenarios, we break it down into like little digestible building blocks, we reconfigure things, and we want to have like a certain guaranteed outcome. The problem is like if you operate in a complex system, you can never predict the outcome of your actions, because you can have like one goal and you can reach that goal, but you always have inadvertently other impacts that you never foresaw because you never took it into account, and it was never part of how you saw the way forward. So I think this is also kind of a lesson, like when we design, when we think of like the next level of design thinking, we have to seriously look at how we overcome this sort of like problem of having this sort of like narrow reductionist goals in reaching, a human-driven vision. So, and this is just sort of like the model of how these like thinking sort of like flows into the model. I don't have to go. And so I think I'm going to stop now before I go into each of these trajectories a little bit more, and then eventually get to Gaia to have a few questions and discussion. Shall I stop sharing for the moment?
Yeah, I think this is a moment in which we could start to make some considerations, as indeed the complexity that we have to face is quite high. But clearly nature has a voice, and the voice was given during the last 30 years in a progressive acceleration of unexpected events that were never happened before. And therefore, the voice of nature started to be loud. It is indeed the complexity of current reality, the way in which we are still deeply into the anthropocentric life, the way in which economy and economic models are structured, the diversity of the thinking between among East and West and North and South, the impact of politics at different level, politics that is focusing on governmental issues that cover a span of time of 4 or 8 years maximum, and it is not really engaged on a long term in order to take the appropriate decisions and strategies, and that can indeed align a community that has proven to be very challenging to be aligned. And of course, religions. So we touched upon religions also in the first dialogue, in the first conference we had, because religion indeed have a major impact on the way in which our mind has been formed and the way in which we have shaped our way of living, and it is different all through the world. And it has been also the cause of many wars, many conflicts, exaggerating the fact that humankind is the first enemy of humankind, and that humankind, when we talk about humanism, we should never forget that humanism have a good side and an evil side that we have to definitely take in consideration if we wanted to indeed aim toward directing the future in a way that benefits will be for all the stakeholders of the ecosystems. Clearly, politics is currently still quite distant from the technological advance. Like in the case of internet, the evidence of what could have been the threat of criminal mindset was not even taken in consideration. And when things happen, politics takes time to be capable to address the issue. So it is important to help to reduce the gap between politics and technological advance, to have a better understanding of what is happening and what is desirable, and in which way eventually we have to think about the complexity of the interconnections in order to explore the strategies to apply.
It's interesting also, Stefano, to see like this in general in the world. There seems to be over time like a weakening of all the institutions. You know, there's like a weakening of governance, weakening of democracy. You know, democracy is like everywhere. And so all these institutions that we've built, you think also like of the institutions of like the global economy. You know, the countries are more and more pulling back from the global economy. And you see sort of like other, the economy is still at large, you know, the growth material driven economy. And that is like the elephant in the room that, you know, has to change together with this. And you see more and more sort of like from platforms like strong voices emerging that is almost like taking or benefiting from weakening institutions, you know, and you can think of like some of them are negative, some of them are positive. You can think of a Greta Thurman on the one end. You can think of like the woke and cancel culture, you know, that has become like a very dominant and a very strong voice shaping politics, shaping thinking everywhere in the world. So I think it's good to understand how these dynamics are changing. And in this time of like flux and change, we also have to see what is the opportunity for us to seize that opportunity for what we believe has to happen, you know.
Well, just continuing on this topic is on the religion side, which has quite an impact on the way which society thinks, and also the barriers that we face or we can face in order to form a global Earth community, an ecosystem community with all the different beliefs. However, this complexity is exceeding the ability of the single individual or let's say, of a number of individuals, different disciplines that want to, let's say, find a way to progress into this. What is important is to be aware of all this and try to see how our daily activity and our engagement in participating in redirecting whatever we do in a way that can actually be a link between the now and the future, small steps that can help people to find those solutions, those approaches that can progressively take us toward a desired transformation.
Yeah.
So we have to make sure that in our approach, we are not frustrating all the people, because it is so complex and it appears so unreachable by the single individual that it is going to demoralize. And we have to make sure that we are aware of, but that we understand that we have to look at the ways in which we can take the first steps, the first action, changing on, first of all, on ourselves and the way in which we operate there where we can have impact and influence. It might be the moment also to have some comments from Sabrina or from also Carmen or other participants, just to add a bit more feedback and more opinions before we enter into Gaia as explanation of the future that we intend to select and to use to, let's say, explore and exercise this intended way to give to design a different opportunity to have impact on the future.
I'll try if you want, but because I do think that our humanism will save us. I often wonder if design is adrift. I sometimes think that our discipline, because design is my mode to improve, to enter in this discussion, but it's not the word, my approach. I sometimes think that our disciplines has lost its sense and measure, especially in research. I think because the multidisciplinary approach is confused with the omnipotence of design to be able or to have to deal with everything. With the project, perhaps we need to take a step back, I think, a step back and ask ourselves, what are dystopias, probably, for first. And then I read about your scenario realm, and I think your envisage are plausible, but they are not very rassurating, I think is the word. So to create innovation in design, are dystopias more profitable than utopias?
So I think the question for me is that, is everything about profit? In our current economic model, yes, it is. But I think, we have to start to ask ourselves, like, what is really value? What is really making life meaningful? And I think, as we have pursued sort of like material progress, we've been in a constant sort of like crisis of meaning. People were like chasing meaning by expressing themselves through material things. And it led to a kind of like a culture of like emptiness, which is, I think, even becoming worse, in my opinion. So I think, to get back to the essence of like what makes the human experience rich, worthwhile, and not only in your life, but how is your life connected to the lives before you and the lives after you, and start to take a different view. I think there's like, and it's a difficult thing because like Stefan also said, it's super complex. And I will get to some examples later, but I strongly believe, you can take top-down actions and some things you can try to make scalable. But my motto, because I'm more invested in Gaia, And I always say, like, the planet is 4.5 billion years old. The planet knows a lot because it survived for 4.5 billion years. Homo sapiens has been here for 200,000 years. It's like the last second. We came to a party and we sort of like tore up the whole book with like all the rules and all the wisdom, and we think we know it all. So I think, let's see what we can learn from nature and how nature does things. But I will get back. I don't want to jump ahead with my story. And I think a lot of the things, if you look at ecosystems, there's not one ecosystem in the world. There's lots of sort of like, almost like competing and adjacent sort of like ecosystems. How do we strengthen those, and how do we connect and start actions with local ecosystems? Because the way that, nature works, it basically focuses local. It focuses on local ecosystem, and it focuses on a huge diversity of solutions. And the problem is like, coming from a corporation also, corporations functioning in the global economy, they always want to look for like the winning solution that's going to scale globally and take over the globe. And it dramatically reduces resilience because you have one solution. There's like many examples of that. And so nature sort of like favors a diversity of solutions and with overlapping functions. And it's better to do them with the best local fit rather than try to. So there's a lot of these elements in design that we have to start to question and reflect about.
Thank you.
Any other comment? Carmen, do you want to make a comment, or any participant feel the urgency to make a comment and an observation?
Yes, I have a question too. Then I can leave the word to participants if they want. I have been fascinated by the first part on values and, for example, on the metaphor of the arrow of time. And I think that more crises, like, for example, the fall of the governance or the fall of the institutions and so on, can be derived from these values and these perspectives that can that are not more suitable to the complexity of the world. So the question is if design can engage a political role, let's say normative dimension that can inspire new perspectives to product or processes or new systems. And so if it's a normative dimension and it's synthesization capabilities can be maybe the new political, the new philosophical driver for future new life modes, new life ways.
Yeah, I think, obviously, I think what I'm careful for is to think we use our influence only to push like top-down change, like, for example, I think Stefano mentioned also the COVID, like people change behavior, everybody was wearing masks, staying home. But a lot of that was also forced by people because of like government rules, etc. And it was enforced with like punishment if you don't do it. And in the end, it also started to create like mass protests and backlashes and so on, So I think, I agree, top-down influence is very important because we have to start to change the way our leaders, think, and people in politics. But there's also a need for a transformation that really goes bottom up, that touches the soul of people. And I believe, why I'm inspired by Greta Thurman is that, my generation grew up also in the paradigm of like progress, materialism, etc., etc. We see the world in a certain way. And the older you get, the more difficult it is also to change some of those things, Whereas like the generation of Greta Thurman, they are inheriting this sort of like damaged world. They don't have like the material aspirations that I grew up with. So I think, a very powerful place to start is how do we engage? How do we bring some of this thinking very early on in the education system, create ways for young people to really engage with nature, work with models that are compatible with nature. Because I think in one way we are running out of time, so there's a need for drastically reducing the human footprint, and that probably is best driven like top down to make some. And it's almost like if somebody's hit by a car, first you have to do the triage, you have to stop the bleeding, you have to stabilize the patient on the road, and that's what we need to do fast, so there is a need for that kind of fast action. But then the patient still has to go to the hospital for like really reconstructive surgery and revalidation, rehabilitation, and I think that is a slow process. So I think working on the individual, working on society, working on local culture, it's a slower process. It's not something, because it fundamentally changes. It has to change who we are, how we see ourselves, how we see our connection, and that is a slower process. And we have to understand where are the best touch points to start. And for the triage, we have to understand what are the things that we can leverage and bring that together.
If I may react, yeah, let's say I agree. However, I think that somewhere we have to start, and we have to take the opportunities we have to create pills and that can be detonator of bringing awareness. So I'm not necessarily thinking that we have to operate top down. I think it has to come from all parts. Having this conversation and this discussion here is already a start point, is a pills, a little detonators that bring within an educational institutions where a university where there are very different faculties that are dealing with different technologies, with different subjects. It brings a seeds of thinking that can actually provide the opportunity to start to generate some visualization, some ideas that can actually be taken into another level of debate and start to create a rolling, a self-propelling prophecy of a thinking that currently it doesn't happen. Yeah. It doesn't happen because it is so complex and people are engaged with problems that focus themselves on a relative short term, and the long term comes always later. But as you say, we have to start from the early moment of the crash and start to indicate how we can secure the patient, and then start to envisage what are the many possible ways to address the recovery. Yeah. And they might be very different way. And in this, the engagement of the participants that are all of, let's say, young, and they are going to own the future. There is the interest of starting to indeed exploring, starting to understand in which way is possible to take, let's say, actions in a way that this topic, this subject, can be taken at higher level of awareness, and therefore provide the opportunities that we are looking for. Yeah. And as was mentioned, I think Carmen said correctly, well, design can have a role into this because it has the ability to synthesize, but also to visualize, to create more understandable what the challenge is and what this represent for our society, and definitely not suggesting already solution, but providing ways to understand the complexity that we face and help to engage with a larger community of disciplines and to take, let's say, the actions in a way that we can indeed aim to direct the future toward what is a desired end. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
I'm happy because we are trying to do our part. So
I want to ask something. Shall I quickly just sort of like give a glimpse of the other streams before I go to Gaia, or do you want me to jump straight to Gaia? Because I think there's also it's interesting to understand also really well the difference between sustainability and Gaia.
I would say so, because this is a moment where we can create, we can share information and thinking and some views that let's say can help everybody to formulate and to form their own opinion and their own view, because we need these diversities of view, opinions, and critical debate to make following steps. Sabrina, if you agree, we can.
Okay, so I try not to spend too much time on the other trajectories, but I will quickly take you through them.
All right.
Let's see again. Oh, no, I'm struggling to find my slide on the screen. Wait, just a moment.
Any participant?
Here we go.
Okay, then.
You see again my slide?
Yes. Okay.
So I will start, with not at the top. I will start more closer to the mainstream with transmutation, superhuman, transhuman, immortalia, with that direction. So that direction, as I said, is very anthropocentric. It values human progress. So it's like really built on the ideals of like human progress through science and technology. It's very utilitarian. So we believe in that direction. People believe that they can sort of like just exploit the planet, and it's very kind of opportunistic. You see that, in my view, quite strong also in many parts of like America, like just really taking technology and pushing it forward as fast as we can. So it's really about transcending Homo sapiens through technology progress. That is what Immortalia is about. It is really enabled by what we call the fourth industrial revolution, and it's a convergence between nanotech, biotech, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. All these streams are basically starting to work together. It's not that they are being explored as separate disciplines anymore. You have like multidisciplinary teams working together across these. But it also, on one hand, it creates a lot of inequality, because many people in the world will never have access to these advanced technologies, and they will be left behind. The other question, and this is like just a question that I have, is like, are we, creating a world where we are increasingly like reliant on technology, to do things for us, to think for us? And does it eventually diminish our own cognitive functions? And that is like a question. And I think, if I look for the key enablers of transhumanism, there are like really two strong branches, and they are a product, all of them, of multiple streams of technologies coming together. The one is cognitive computing. And, so increasingly there's like a lot of progress whereby you can actually have prosthetics if you lost your arm, and it can be directly linked to your brain, and you can control those prosthetics, by using your mind. So those interfaces are already being built. Elon Musk's company, Neuralink, has this technique whereby they put nanoprobes directly into the brain. And with a technique called optogenetic recording, they record all your brain neuron firings. They start to understand that patterns. They're building a software interface that you can wirelessly connect to the internet and to the data, and you can basically just think and you get information. So your brain is basically expanded. In the first wave, they will use it, for example, for people who are paraplegic to communicate the rest of their body, you know, where like something is severed. But eventually the view is to make that to make computers and the internet seamlessly interacting with the human brain. This is where it's going. And there's already, you know, like the metaverse is the first step that Facebook is taking into the direction of what they call the neuroeconomy, whereby they will economize and they will commoditize humans' brains. You know, so you can see that as positive or negative, but this is sort of like something that is building up here. So, Stefano, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I want to add one point here, because this is one of the future that most probably can generate the most frightening dystopia. Yeah. The technology in itself, it is not negative or positive. It's the use that we are going to do with the technology. So all this potentiality is there, and in principle can benefit people and can benefit the environment also.
Yeah.
The negative side of humanity that will determine how this technology will impact society, human being, is the very dangerous aspect.
And I think you are right, Stefano. And I think it is amplified by our current socioeconomic system, whereby people do things because they are chasing bigger profits and bigger power. You know, so it's not the technology itself, it's how the technology is deployed in that socioeconomic system that is causing the problem and the disconnect.
Yeah, is the utilization of the technology, the way in which technology will use. And this is when actually looking, or when the future will take form in a way or another, it is relevant to maintain this understanding that technology by itself is not negative. Is the way in which technology is going to be used that is going to determine how this technology will create more pain than benefit.
Yeah.
And in which way it is possible to anticipate and to think how it is possible to prevent a wrong utilization of these technologies.
Yeah.
So not repeating what has happened with internet, cybercrime, privacy, security issues. So what actually is that design can do to think how to integrate in the technology the ability to be self-selecting for a benefit.
So I want to quickly finish this section. So on the molecular biology and biotechnology side, there's sort of like the advances in stem cell technology, where you can take a stem cell and you convert it into the cell of any particular type of organ, and you can make scaffolds and use organ bioprinting. Eventually, in the future, you may be able to print a new heart and a new kidney for somebody, you know, just using this technology. The question is, like, this will be accessible for 1% of the world's population, most probably, you know. So it's something to keep in mind. You know, we can do these things, but how many of us really benefit? And is it really a benefit for us to live much longer, or should we rather aspire to live better and, you know, make a more positive impact in our? So these are questions. I'm not giving answers. I'm giving the questions that I have. Then, you know, modifying human genes with the CRISPR technology. If you modify the germline, it means those gene modifications will become permanent also in the progeny of humanity, and it's very dangerous because we tend to think of like a gene as one function, but many genes have a number of functions which we very poorly understand. And over time, you know, we can actually really do damage in the human genetic lineage if we start to tamper with the germline modification. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then this is also something that is very interesting, is generative biology and digital to biological conversion. There's a guy called Craig Venter. He has a laboratory, and they have created an artificial life form. synthesized, they've designed DNA, genes, they've synthesized it in a machine, they've synthesized like the fatty acids from the cell membrane and under the organelles and the basic constituents. They mix it together. They started with bottles of chemicals, and they have now a bacteria, a life form that never existed before, that they created from chemicals. You know, so
yeah.
It is exciting and scary at the same time. You know,
it is specifically on these areas of challenges that I was very much interested to understand what actually is the position also of the spiritual leadership. So the view of religions that have been shaping our mind and the idea of humans and humanity with respect to the rest of society, and with the role in the world and the nature. So how the spiritual leadership look at this, that shape somehow the foundation of the idea of creation.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a role of a divinity.
It closes the gap between life and non-life. There was always like a gray zone, but now it closes that gap, and it raises a lot of different questions. And the reason they're doing this is they say, like for space travel, if you want to send somebody 100,000 light years away, they basically looking towards like printable organisms, whereby you can send chemicals for 100,000 years, and when you arrive at the destination, you can basically print life. That is the view. So it raises a lot of these questions.
Well, the point here is probably there are situations where an application of an organ is going to be a benefit.
Sure.
The question is whether the politics is aware as the understanding of what this potentiality
consequences are. Yeah,
because the politics should be engaged also in participating in defining what is the desirable life, and in a sense also be concerned with regulating what is going to be possible with the development of these technologies. Nothing wrong in these technologies, but it might be very useful. But this again is the way in which the technologies will happen. The reason why they are intended to be used, the way in which economically intended to be exploited. So in the hands of design, there is also the opportunity to explore both the benefits that can fit into a desired future, and explore the dystopias that would be interesting to take into a debate to understand how this fit into a broader view about the desirable future.
Indeed, I think design can also trigger and help to ask the right questions, because quite often we race towards like answers, but we don't ask the relevant and the right questions, you know, before it's too late. So I'm going to go to Etheria, and this is, you know, this sounds very science fiction. That is like the post-biological. And like I said, it was driven by the Ray Kurzweil idea that we should merge with artificial intelligence. And it also raises a lot of questions, like, for example, like if you would merge with an intelligence that is rapidly advancing, it's like taking a drop and throw it in the ocean. Can you still have an identity in such an intelligence if you merge with that? What does it do to who you are? You know, this. But the singularity is it real. This is like Ila Sutskever. He's the co-founder and director of OpenAI, and they are developing a system called artificial general intelligence. AI is basically normally shaped for like seeing patterns in like one specific area. So it's like very much sort of like you have to train it to focus on one. For example, it can see tumors in radiography scans more easily than humans because it's really trained to see those patterns. Artificial general intelligence is a new form of intelligence that learn and develop unsupervised. The intelligence, it sets its own goals for self-development, and it basically learns without human intervention. So, and they believe that they can achieve AGI in 10 years. And Microsoft is one of the big investors now. They are a late investor, and they've developed a sort of like a language engine for Microsoft, which is almost indistinguishable from human speech. It can basically construct sentences, understand meaning, and it basically can write essays or write books. So this is an area that's developing very fast. There's now techniques to basically use AI by just using an fMRI scan of your brain. Those patterns of blood flows in the vessels can be, and they've asked somebody to look at an image, not telling them what image it is, and they just use that and use a deep generator network to analyze those signals. And basically, from just the patterns in your brain, they can distill eventually what you've looked at. So it's fascinating, how the gap is closing in sort of like bringing computing and what is happening in your brain together. These are like really big projects with billions of funding behind them. It's like the EU Brain Project and the Brain Initiative in the US. There's also private projects. And what they are doing is like they're also using this like optogenetic recording technique that sort of like constantly monitors tens of thousands or millions of neuron firings and start to understand what those patterns mean. And they model it in a supercomputer. And basically what they want to do is they want to work towards what they call a substrate independent mind, where they can decouple it from the human and it will continue to think like a human brain. So there are, arguments like to say like it might never happen because, our current model is still a software hardware model, whereas the human brain is only a brain. It does the software and the hardware in one task. But there's a group in the Radboud University in the Netherlands, Alexander Kayatorians. They've developed an intelligent material that learns by physically changing itself like the brain. So this material is like a quantum network, and the material learns from environment that it experiences. It remembers things. It constantly reconfigures itself, and it becomes more intelligent. And they see this as the next wave of aiming towards artificial intelligence. It will not be a software hardware dichotomy anymore. They will move towards materials that do that function. So it's just interesting to know that this is not just science fiction. These things are really happening. I don't want to spend too much time there. Let's go to sustainability, because I want to understand, I want to share the view. The thing is, Habitania, the idea of like creating safe spaces for nature and making sure nature can flourish next to human civilization. There's in 2018, was a very interesting paper by, I think it was Donovo, Pym, and Montoya. Montoya is the key author, wrote a paper to say that our current policies and execution of sustainability is not rooted in reliable science, and it creates really a false sense of security of what sustainability can achieve, and that it creates a false sense of security that with the current approach to sustainability, we can save the planet. And one of the reasons is that if you look in the 1900s, the wilderness of the planet was 85% and the human footprint was 15%. That's a little bit more than 100 years ago. Now, a bit more than 100 years later, the human footprint heavily dominating the planet is 77%. Only 23% of land is still in wilderness, and much of that is in areas that are desert. And these areas are not even well protected, and it's rapidly shrinking, So the idea of creating safe spaces for nature, is not viable, because like we have impacted so much on these like ecosystems, and ecosystems need a footprint, and they need also connected footprints, you know, to really flourish and to continue evolving. Otherwise, it will just start to decline and implode like we are seeing right now. So we cannot save nature, and we cannot save the implosion just by the circular economy, by thinking, okay, we're going to take the stuff we have, we're going to recircularize, we're not going to add any more pressure to the environment by the circular economy. It's like the triage that I've talked about. You know, it's some of the first steps we can take is to stop adding more damage to the environment, as we can do the circular economy. But the circular economy will not save us. For that, we have to dramatically reverse the human footprint, which is a huge challenge. And there's a very famous biologist called Theo Wilson. I think he died recently, but he came up with the idea that we need to give 50% of the planet back to nature. And it has to be that nature should not be guided or curated by humans, but we should allow the voice of nature to flourish, and nature should repair itself, because nature over the 4,500 million years has shown that it has a billion years has shown that it can really repair itself. It can take care of itself if you give it the space to do so. So there's an initiative now called like the Global Deal for Nature, and they have actually calculated that by spending 0.1% of the world economy for the next 50 years, we can actually achieve this, you know. So this is like something that is there's like a whole movement now, the 50% Earth movement behind this. But if you look also at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of these goals, you know, I'm quite critical about them because they tend to work against each other. For example, if you take like no poverty, decent work, economic growth, you know, there is no country that achieved economic advance without destroying the environment and causing incredible environmental impact. China is one example. They've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty with devastating impact on the environment, you know. You cannot have like climate action, life below water, 13 or 14, but at the same time, you want to grow industry and infrastructure, you know. So I think, you know, this model, for me, is a model that was like created to pull in as many stakeholders so that they can sort of like feel okay with it. You know, it's like, for me, like more of a political compromise than it is really trying to solve things. And I think to create a planet that is healthy, eventually, we will have to go way, way, way beyond this. So this is just a take on it. So I don't want to go too deep, and I don't want to sort of like say more about this. Maybe one thing to say is that, you know, also now with sustainability is we talk about changing human behavior, but for many humans, it feels, and this is also why you have a lot of people against green and against because it feels like it's forced upon them. There's like a compliance that they don't want to do, and they have to compromise what they want. And because there's not a change of heart, it's like a top-down enforcement. And in China, there's this sort of like surveillance society whereby they monitor, you know, what you do, how you, what waste you are creating, how you are driving, your political views, and basically those things are used to create a social credit score, and that social credit score determines, you know, if you can use public transport, what level of education they will allow you to do, what healthcare you can access, you know. So the thing is, for me, what I'm scared of sustainability is that because sustainability is resource centric, and we see resources as scarce, and also with automation now, there's a high likelihood that in the next decades, half of the population will be unemployed. And this is also why countries are experimenting with this idea of like a basic minimum income for everybody. But if that is a scenario that may unfold, it also means that you will actually have to control top down, you know, to keep people, you know, complying. And for me, this is the wrong way to go. And this is why I think Gaia is, for me, a space that sort of like really has a different take on what we should do and how we should think. Do you want to have a quick discussion before we move on to Gaia? And then this is the last section. Yes, Stefano.
I would like only to mention that this is an indication of a possible activity, of a possible action. The one to re-educate people to having care, to understand how they have a stake in the life they live and in the world, and to develop a feeling and a sentiment that is providing the coexistence with and the understanding of the call of caring for the environment, something that makes good the spirit and the heart, and that is going to be embraced. So this is a project, this is also a project of design, is a project of education, is a project that can have, that can stimulate ways to further develop this understanding, and probably is also a wrong communication that does, let's say, limit the opportunity of absorbing and understanding this. So, and a project like this, or helping the people to develop this awareness and this sentiment, can be also facilitator of the future of Gaia, the interest in, let's say, in going for or desiring an ecosystem future.
Yeah. Shall I continue with the Gaia? Or is there anybody else who has something to mention or to ask or to?
I want to say something. If I understand well, we can we say that we should not look for the cure, but how to prevent damage. We should not change things, but change minds. Can we say that the issue is not sustainability, but responsibility?
Yeah. I have a slide on that later, so I think you are really on the right track. With
sorry.
So again, you know, so I will touch upon that later, because I think this is important to understand. It's not by creating only technologies and things that we're going to change the world. You know, the change has to come from within at the same time. You know, and how do we do that? And so yeah. Okay, Stefano, you had something to say?
No, it is
okay. So
perfectly aligned. It's education.
So I start with the Gaia story, and you know, Gaia interacts with the planet geology to create conditions that are more conducive to life. You know, so I mentioned, you know, again, the planet operates like a super organism. The thing is, you know, we have created in our own minds, and especially in the West, the idea of human exceptionalism, that, you know, we are an exceptional species and we put ourselves above other species because we think we are more intelligent, we can shape the world, you know, we have certain capabilities, we have reason, we have logic. And Gaia really sort of like takes that into question. And the thing is, it's like, since the Greek philosophers, that we've put a very high value or a price tag on sentience and intelligence. But there are many kinds of intelligence, firstly. And secondly, it's a little bit of an arbitrary choice. Why do we not take photosynthesis and say, like, photosynthesis should be at the top? Because, like, photosynthesis gives oxygen for everybody, you know? Maybe it's more valuable to the planet than human intelligence, you know? So I think, you know, if we go to the post-anthropocentric world, we have to change that view that we are exceptional, and we have to start to deeply look for and try to understand and comprehend the value of not only other species, but how the relationship between those species bring another level of value. Now, the thing is with complex systems, We have the tendency, like I mentioned before, with with a reductionist approach, that we think we go from understanding how things work, breaking it down to smaller components, go down to the atom level, so we understand how everything works, that we get more insight. We get some more insight, but we also lose a lot of insight, because complex systems means that the system itself has properties and has capabilities that does not exist in any of the constituents. That is the and those abilities of a complex system is in the relationships. I can give you like maybe a very stupid example. If you take a television set, you smash it to atoms. By looking at the atoms through a microscope, you're not going to learn anything from the system that makes a television. You're going to learn about the atoms, okay? The television set is because the atoms has been sort of like cooperating in a certain relationship that gives it properties that none of the atoms have in itself. And this is a way that we have to sort of like look at complex systems, and being part of such a complex system gives humans capabilities way beyond our own sort of like narrowly confined human exceptionalism capabilities. So this is, I think, something that I want to mention. Also, like, if you look at the forest, and I maybe go to the next slide. Yeah, so we have to move away from this like ego idea that puts us on top of nature towards like an ecocentric view that say like we are one species, but together with all the other species, if we sort of like strengthen those relationships, this will be actually much more resilient and much more powerful. And this is how ecosystems stay resilient, is because ecosystems have collaborative functions and they have also overlapping functions. If one species die out, there's a multitude of species that have similar functions that they can step in and take those functions over to the benefit of the entire ecosystem. This is why ecosystems are resilient. If too many species die too soon, you cannot fulfill those functions and everything starts to collapse. So this is also sort of like, I think, why that is important. I think it's very important just to understand that principle. And if we talk about a biovision or life, we're not only talking about organic substances or organic technology. We're talking about something that is fundamentally connected to the ecosystem and put the value of the ecosystem at the top and really sort of like interrogate that and be and as conscious of that and constantly trying to actually link to these ecosystems. Like I said also before, ecosystems are very diverse, and this is also what gives the planet its resilience. And this is like, it's not a one size fits all. You have one great idea and you just sort of like scale it to the rest of the world. By creating a lot of like diverse ideas that best fit in local context and in local ecosystems, you add to the resilience of the planet. And nature has incredible powers to heal itself and to replenish itself. If you give it the space, it has answers and it has technologies that we can only dream of. We think our technologies are advanced, like we make all this like wonderful things with more like classical scientific technologies. But if you consider like photosynthesis, taking sunlight and converting it, into biomass, it's a technology that we cannot match with all the technology that we have built. It's something that nature has already built millions of years ago. Or billions of years ago. We still cannot match that. If we talk about like we are building batteries, for cars, and those batteries by and large, have to be mined. We have to destroy the environment to put those batteries into cars to store electricity, and they are toxic for the environment, also to dispose of them. If you look at the eel, the electric eel, if you touch an electric eel, it can shock an adult human to death. It is an incredible capacitor that is developed by biological technologies millions of years ago. We cannot even touch the level of sophistication of that technology. So our technologies by and large are actually very crude by comparison to nature. It's also very harmful. So let's first look, and I think I saw that you structured this in a sort of like body, house, city, world, and it's interesting. I couldn't adapt the entire presentation, but I sort of like tried to sort of like touch a little bit upon that. If we look at what is a human being, okay, our human bodies consists of 40% human cells and 60% bacterial cells. Each of us are more bacteria than we are human. Okay, we have, and these bacteria are not just there or they just benefit from the body. We get more benefits from the bacteria than they get from us almost, because those bacteria can also live in other environments. Our mental health is dramatically influenced by bacteria. There's a nerve called the vagus nerve that basically connects the brain directly to the gut, and there's a very high concentration of nerve cells around our gut. And if you talk about a gut feel, it's almost like there's a second brain in the gut. And bacteria in our gut is constantly doing like a electrochemical signaling via the vagus nerve to our brain. So the food that we digest, our health, our mental state, everything is connected, you know, through this sort of like bacteria. Actually, we are not a species. We are what they call a holobiont. A holobiont means a large collection of species living together as a single organism. That is what we are, you know. And in the human diet, you know, we have shifted our diet. You know, when we were hunter-gatherers, we had like a very diverse diet that could really replenish and sort of like feed and keep this entire ecosystem healthy. And with the industrial agriculture, we've limited not only the variety, but you know, we have by being exposed to pesticides in the way that food is processed, we are damaging our microbiome. If you compare our microbiome with the microbiome of still some hunter-gatherer tribes, firstly, there's a lot less diversity. And there's actually microbes that also occur in the hunter-gatherers that are not pathogenic. They are actually giving benefits, but when they are in our microbiome, they become pathogens because the balance is disturbed and they change their behavior. You know, so I think how we interact with our environments has a profound impact on our health. And it's not just our body, because we are constantly interacting with our environment, the environment around us, our home, our workplace, and what we eat, the air that we breathe. And it has a constant impact sort of like on this ecosystem. So our thinking, you know, has to really sort of like shift in terms of like what is healthy, what is sick. Because the thing is, if you look also at the healthcare system today, it's all about diagnose and cure, because this is where companies make money. You know, it's like sophisticated equipment that diagnose early and then go for an intervention to hospital. But we are living in an environment that creates illness. I mean, if you look in the average domestic environment in industrialized economies, your house has more than 100,000 chemicals that was not there 100 years ago. More than 100,000 chemicals, and those chemicals all sort of like damage various parts. It puts incredible inflammation and strain on our microbiome. You can see, for example, many diseases like Asperger's, autism, Crohn's disease, Alzheimer's occurs at a much higher incident in Western industrialized nations than it occur in sort of like rural settings in underdeveloped nations. So we have created a system where our healthcare becomes very expensive. We constantly have to pay more for healthcare. Doctors are burnt out, overburdened. They can only see you for 10 minutes at a time. And it's all about diagnose and cure. So we live in an environment that makes us sick, and then we have to spend a fortune to be cured. You know, so I think we have to start to question the entire system, you know. So that is, you know, and Stefano said earlier, it's very complex. Yes, it is very complex, because you cannot only think of sort of like one aspect. We have to fundamentally start to think about what we are, who we are. If you feed yourself, you're not only feeding you as a person, you are feeding this holobiont, you know, of organisms. But to be aware of that, and also, this is very much linked to circadian rhythms. Your DNA and also the DNA of bacteria follow like rhythms. The planet has a very low resonance called Schumann resonances. The Schumann resonance was discovered in the 1950s by a German scientist, And it's like 7.86 hertz. It's a very low frequency, and it sets the biorhythms of the entire planet, you know. And these biorhythms are important because, like, of all of our thousands of genes, they are not active all the time. Some of them sort of like get shut down, they go to sleep, others become active based on your biorhythm. Your body knows now it's time for you to eat, now it's time to go to sleep. Genes get switched on and off. If you disturb that with artificial lighting, with eating at the wrong time, eating the wrong food in the wrong season, all of this starts to come into sort of like a disbalance that compromises your health. So I think, you know, we have to start to really understand this thing of like just sort of like thinking we can be on the wheel of progress. I think understanding these cycles is very, very important. There's also the thing of like, why do we struggle so much to connect to nature? Because like we've lived in cities that are largely artificial. Our living environments mainly consist of dead objects, you know. So we are the only species that in our habitat surround ourselves mainly with dead objects. And we are also the only species on the planet who create waste that no other species can use. For all other species, and this is why, like in natural ecosystem, there's always an abundance, because it's not about efficiency. Nature is quite inefficient because it creates a lot of redundancy, a lot of overlap, but the waste of one species is always the food of another species. But, sorry.
It's okay. I just want to give a small example that just support and validate what you're saying. Very simple, but wolf has been recently reintroduced in nature, in parks, because indeed the waste of what wolf produced by providing its food is food for the others. And what is also interesting is that very recently the wolf have been capable to kill more animals, simply because the animals, the deers, could not actually adapt to the legal hour. So they are crossing the highway, and they used to cross the highway before the change of the legal hour. And many animals died because they were keeping crossing the highway, but the legal hour changed the time in which the traffic was coming. So it is interesting. On one side is the cycle, the circadian cycles. So the nature doesn't recognize the legal hour. They have another rhythm. So it makes the sense of what you say. And the other is, indeed, after the reintroduction of the wolf, we have seen the ecosystem in these spaces revamp and come to a new level of richness.
So, in any case, I'm going to explain a few of these things, because I think today is one of those days that I have more time than usual. So it's nice to explain some of these examples. There's this whole thing of like shamanism and spirituality. And it's very interesting, like if you look in the diet of hunter-gatherers and like traditional societies, it's not like, you know, today where there's like drug dealers and drug abuse and it becomes like a drug industry. But through the human experience over like the last 2 million years, we have been in constant contact, eating psychoactive substances like magic mushrooms and these things. That's been part of like the foraging diet. You know, when we were foraging, we were also encountering these things. And there's now anthropologists basically that wrote a thesis that these psychoactive substances create a much higher level of interconnection in the brain. They've also shown, like in studies in animals, that it dramatically increases the plasticity of the brain. It means, and this is why they also give it now to patients suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, because these psychoactive substances can help your brain to rewire itself. And it sort of like gives you a sense of being really connected to the world. And there's there are people believing now that the human spirituality is rooted in and it started to actually develop in the brain because of our history of encountering psychoactive substances in the diet. Now, in our Western society, which is completely geared towards productivity, we've put a ban on these drugs. We are basically have industrial processes that have only sort of like a limited lines of food that we eat. So actually what we can say is our diet, programs us for a rational existence, because it takes away the sort of like subjective experience, this feeling of connectedness that people feel. There's now, I think, a re-emerging trend of like micro-dosing, where you take micro doses of like psychoactive substances. You don't go on a trip, but it just sort of like relaxes people a little bit more, and you feel much more connected and open to experiences, and you feel much more connected to nature. So it's interesting to understand through the human history, by almost like through our social and through our policies, I've programmed us to actually disconnect more and more from nature. It's just good to reflect on that. There's also in Japan a practice called Shinrin Yuko. And if people are suffering from a wide variety of illnesses, especially stress and high blood pressure, they get a prescription to spend time in nature, away from electronic signals and lighting and stuff that disrupt your circadian rhythms. Just touching nature, being in touch with nature, experiencing nature is more effective than any blood pressure medicine that you can take. And even in Scotland, they've started to now make that like an official sort of like prescription. So it's really, really interesting, sort of like, what is the sort of like the power of nature? Now, if we design, so I move a little bit forward now, thinking about design, there's this sort of like, we also have to ask from design, because I think we have developed sort of like a certain approach, a certain sophistication, a certain aesthetic, etc. But with indigenism, if you look at the principles of designing really useful artifacts, but that is completely embedded in nature, and all the species participating benefits, you really see that clearly. And that's a lesson that we can learn from indigenous design, that basically just uses nature, but without any detriment to nature. And what is interesting to understand also, we had for a long time this idea of like evolution work is like the survival of the fittest, which is a complete wrong interpretation of evolution, because evolution is not happening on a species level. It really sort of like happens on a systems level, and systems sort of like adapt. And the basis for evolution is symbiosis. And Lynn Margulis, that scientist that wrote that in her book, that much of the evolution that we see is based on symbiotic relationships between different organisms in an ecosystem. And you get different types of symbiosis. You can also have parasites, or you can have predators, but that is a minority, and it's also necessary to keep the balance. It's good to keep that in mind. Not everything in nature is immediately benign. It can also sort of like, they can also be harmed, but that is a part of keeping the balance. This is also why in nature, Stefano talked about the wolves. You always see a tiny number of predators and a large number of other animals. This is kind of like a part of the balance of nature. So most of nature is based on a principle or a type of symbiosis called mutualism. It means all species who participate benefits. And I think to keep in mind, like if we design, most of our designs, we should try to build around mutualism, understanding the context in which this sort of like will play a role, how it will link to local ecosystems, and how can there be mutual benefits. And this is the one principle that's very clearly demonstrated with this like low-tech design by indigenous people. And indigenous people, far more than conservationists, have a much higher success rate in keeping ecosystems intact. Conservation really started to ramp up in the 1970s, and since then I think we have lost 60% of mammalian species and 75% of insects. These species have plummeted because our conservation is quite often, we only have identified 8% of the species of the planet. 92% of the species of the planet has not been identified yet. So how can you conserve something and, you know, use your own sort of like powers of curation if you don't even know what you are dealing with? You know? So that is why I think you have to give the power and the voice to these ecosystems, and indigenous people live in harmony with these ecosystems, and this is why it's possible. Our conservationist effort is like, again, kind of like top down, human on top. We take the decisions on behalf of nature. We are the self-appointed custodian of nature. And that is where often things go wrong, you know. So it's just, I wanted to put that perspective across. So if you think of like biodesign, there are like also all kinds of like ethical consideration. This is a model, these three bubbles is a model from the Biomimicry Institute. And they say, okay, there's like these three, there's like biomorphism, is designing something that looks like a phenomenon in nature. Biomimicry, it functions like a phenomenon in nature. And there's bioutilization, exploits life systems from nature, you know. So this is like all different kinds of like biodesign. I added a bubble, which I think is like missing in my view. And that is like the eco-entangled. And it doesn't mean you can always achieve eco-entangled, but it's something to really consider, because just because something functions like a phenomenon in nature doesn't mean it's connected to an ecosystem, you know, or just because it utilizes nature, that doesn't mean there's a mutual benefit. So I think, you know, it's really good to understand sort of like how we actually understand eco-entanglement, and eco-entanglement always works on a local ecosystem level. And it's good to sort of like understand that. Then and I'm so happy with all the disciplines involved in this discussion and this initiative, because there's a dire need to shift away from the current portfolio of industrial materials that we use. As I've said before, I think, you know, we think our technologies are advanced, but in my view, a technology cannot be advanced if it deteriorates or destroys, you know, the habitat that you need to survive. Then it cannot be advanced. You know, it's quite obvious. And nature has incredible capabilities that is, you know, that we have not even uncovered yet, that we should tap into. So I think we have to really start to challenge our current technology base and start to demonstrate how we can sort of like start to shift our technology base to materials that can seamlessly integrate with nature. It sounds very difficult because people say like, okay, I have mobile phones, how are you going to do that? Here is an example now that there's two very interesting streams. The one is called protein-based microelectronics, and the other one is wood-based nanoelectronics. And the protein-based electronic is a bacterium called Geobacter sulfuridescens. It is a bacterium that you find in wastewater, and it makes long protein filaments. And it basically it attracts minerals from the environment, and it starts to become like electric conduits. And these bacteria, if you put them together, they can act like a battery. MIT has been working on like really sort of like low-tech batteries where you can basically use wastewater as a battery with this bacteria because it generates energy. And now they are working on these protein filaments to actually put that into microelectronics. So you have electronic circuits, microelectronics based on proteins. Wood is the same, you know, by extracting, I think it's the lignin from wood and giving it some treatments, you can create biodegradable, flexible and transparent microelectronics with the same properties of the very harmful electronics that we use today in circuits. And there are companies now even putting it in their roadmap for future generations of mobile phones would be possibly based on these kind of like new materials. Yes, superwood. Sorry, Stefano, you wanted to?
Sorry, I had the microphone. But since I interrupted you, I think this is an area that does represent a very relevant field of further research. Also because the difference between the environment where actually the indigenous are being utilized, the element of the ecosystem to shape their environment, the bridge and so on, is not, cannot be done in the environment where we live, the environment of the cities and so on. So the only way is to redefine what actually the environment of us as indigenous of the cities can actually further push toward development of the new materials that can, in a way, indeed be integrated and take a new role in reshaping the ecosystem where we are. So definitely this will be an area that can represent a very relevant area of research to further develop new solutions and opportunity to accelerate toward the desired thinking.
Yeah, I completely agree, Stefano. I think what I want to make clear here is that Gaia is not about going back to the Stone Age. Gaia is understanding the principles of nature, understanding the principles of indigenous cultures, like, the fact that what they do was like completely based on mutualism and eco-entanglement, taking those principles and reinterpret those principles with a new technology platform. So there's like superwood. It's like a wood that you can take a very light wood like balsa. And they gave it some treatments, but I think with acid, and it goes through several cycles of compression. It becomes harder and lighter than titanium. You can use it to cut steak. When you drop it on the ground, it sounds like metal. You can use it to actually even build planes. So we can completely replace like the need for certain metals, with some of these technologies. Then, the obvious need is to move towards bioplastics that can degrade. We know the incredible. This is maybe the place to start, is plastics, because I saw now articles, they found plastics now, every time you breathe 30 nanoplastic particles into your lungs.
They are already in our blood.
In our blood. So it is everywhere. And I think this is of crucial importance, to start to actually build a platform that also becomes sustainable and affordable, to integrate and to move away from some of these things. Then also like biobricks, China, there's going to be a huge shortage of, for example, building sand. In the future, they are now en masse scraping the bottom of the ocean with trawlers just to get sand, so they're destroying the life on the ocean floor. Just because of the way that we build, but there's also like mycelium. If you take fungi, they create mycelium, and these mycelium can last for thousands of years if you compress them into like bricks. They are a natural fire retardant, and other fire retardants are in a class that they call forever chemicals. They always stay in the environment, they are toxic, and they never break down. So why do we not sort of like move towards like building with like different kinds of materials? And then there's like mycelium-based leather, which is now also being taken up in the bags of Hermes. They have a leather called Milo, which is based on mycelium leather. And, also I mentioned before, we tend to surround ourselves with dead objects. I think it's time to think of like ways to shift and bring sort of like diversity and eco-diversity and make our homes brimming with diverse life. This is interesting. I don't want to go too much here, because I think you are probably all very familiar with the work of Mary Oxman, that is using a combination of organic materials, mathematical models, 3D printing, generative design, and working with organic materials and organic polymers to create these incredible sort of like structures. It's a completely new way to approach design. It is not only made of organic materials, but it also feels organic. It's a completely new kind of like aesthetic that evokes nature, that I think is fascinating. And there's been that installation also in the Pompidou called Living Biostructures, where they've created sort of like a bioscaffold, and you can actually populate that with like different kinds of like mosses and algae and so on that will sort of like grow and also purify the air. So I think these things I just put here as like really interesting examples, because it's not just sort of like using like raw materials, but it's also combining those raw materials with like sophisticated fractal modeling and computer design and generative design to create really incredible new structures, but that is completely potentially biodegradable or can even integrate into current systems. And then there's like, obviously, how do we give 50% of the planet back to nature? And that is a huge challenge. So I think all this sort of like farmland that we have around us, where products are produced like in India, where it's like there's a water scarcity, it's shipped to the United States, like cabbages full of water is taken from Indian soil, is shipped to the United States, and 35 to 40% of it is basically rotten before it arrives there. I think we have to sort of like rethink the system. Also, the way that we grow food is that we are completely destroying the soil. So in the process, we are destroying, our connection to nature and our health, because food grown in poor quality soil does not have the same nutritional richness. And also, regenerative farming is basically mixing multiple species, wild species and crops together in a similar space. And you can think of all kinds of ways, because what they've already demonstrated in France and a number of other places, you have to use no pesticides, and you get higher quality crops and actually higher yields. The only thing is, like, harvesting is more of a challenge, but you can also think of like how to supplement that with advanced robotics that helps with harvesting, and artificial intelligence. There's all kinds of possibilities to bring this together and start to bring these environments into green cities, growing, connected to the local ecosystem, growing things where it is produced, rather than having this global food system that is actually very fragile. As we've learned now with Ukraine, which is like the breadbasket of the world, they are growing an incredible amount of wheat, and all of a sudden the wheat prices are going through the roof because everybody's relying on them to do it. So I think we have to really sort of like think of alternative ways of how the cities become places not of habitat, but places of culture, but also places of nourishment where everybody can participate and be in closer contact with like a diversity of nature, not just monoculture crop that destroys nature. So this is just sort of like a last thought. The important thing is, how do we recognize, and that is the how do we get people to recognize the state that we are in and agree that, this is almost like you're going through the Alcoholics Anonymous process. The first thing you have to recognize the current condition. And then I think the idea, maybe it's not the only way, but the idea of like half Earth is a fascinating one, because ultimately you want to move again to a whole Earth when everything is sort of like connected and based on mutualism, which is a long trajectory. But in the shorter term, I think first we have to start to do the triage, start to stop the things that contribute immediately to the damage, and find ways to give more space back to nature, to create to the half Earth model. And then we can sort of like experiment and learn how to actually integrate, how to connect to nature, and and prepare society and learn and develop new mindsets that can help us to embrace that before we can actually move to what I call equalize. It's like downsize and equalize. And equalize, I see as a word that is the equivalent of the future economy, because if you look at the economy, our economy is like based on growth and based on like material, hoarding material wealth. Nature, the ecology is the economy. It's the same thing, So I think what we need to do is like take our economy and take the ecology and see how we can shift our economy to function like the ecology. And so I think, instead of civilization, we should be an equalization. So that's just a thought, and you can do with it what you like. And this is the last slide. I'm just thinking, and this is just for reflection. This is not finished, and probably you can shoot holes in it, but I was thinking like also of the role of design is not just, in our sort of like Lebenswelt or our life world where we experience, where we live. It's not just to make an impact by using new artifacts, new materials, new technologies. That is one thing that we have to do. And that is like the pragmatic design of like things that we have to do and things that we have to stop doing or things that we have to do better. But there's also like the mythical design. And the church, the civilizations that we see were built by religious, in Egypt, they built the pyramids because they were basically believing in a myth. The churches, the cathedrals were built because people were pursuing also like a myth of like religious spirituality. So I think that idea of a myth, of something that is like really evoking emotion, getting us involved, fueling us to imagine, that is a very, very important part of design, because I think we don't want to enforce people to comply top down. that cannot be the only way. We need to get people to really become inspired, to want to engage, to want to dream along, and to actually pursue what, for lack of a better word, like a kind of like a myth. So there's like that level of design. And the other is what I call metaphysical design, and that gets closer to the abstract and the spiritual, and it gets closer to mixing design with art, because in the end, we have to start to become aware and create skills to connect to nature that we've lost over time. There's this in mindfulness, there's this technique called interoception. And it also, like, it is a skill that you learn to actually leverage also the vagus nerve. And you become really aware of all the organs of your body. It's a skill that you can nurture and build. And you need like a silence, and it's a skill that you have to develop. And you become really sort of like aware of everything in your body. And you become aware of what you are as a being. And I think that idea of like what we are as a being, we have an ontological challenge, because we still see ourselves as like a human being, a species on top of nature. And we have to change the experience of that, you know, how people experience that you feel like a new being that is connected. How do we do that? And I think art can play a big role here. Spirituality is definitely, but also I think design can contribute to that, because that is like really brings us like the transcendental and the poetic, you know, plays a role in making that evocative enough for us that we start to feel different and see ourselves different. Okay, I stop here, so we still have a little bit of time to discuss. Oh, this one slide, just do a final recap. So in our world, we always think about like resource efficiency, because like we are very resource centric, but we should shift to nature integrated. So this is a very quick recap. We are trained also in design and as companies to also think of like being human centric, think of like human needs, putting the customer first, but we have to shift more towards like ecosystem centricity. It doesn't mean we have to ignore human needs, but you know, that should be at the center. And we are trained to think in terms of outcomes. It's like the reductionist sort of like methodologies that have been like ingrained in us. And we have to think of like emergence and like the principle of Wu Wei of Tao that I mentioned, how to be just in the flow of nature, rather than taking an outcome that we want to achieve. And when you have like this narrow outcome that you want to achieve, you forget that the outcome also has like unintended impacts. So it's something to reflect on, you know, how do we actually design for emergence, from a competitive advantage to mutuality in relationships. So linking to nature is all about designing for mutuality in relationships. And from designing for scale towards diversity and local congruence. So like diversity is really the winning recipe of nature that has been demonstrated over and over. And it's not just diversity, but it's how those diversities connected in relationships that count. So that is really where I stop. So we can have a bit of a discussion.
Good. Could you go back to the second last
yes
slide? Yeah, because this does represent what we have been also discussing about a lot about the let's say the pragmatism, so the need of having a part of this that is integrated into the idea of the regenerative solution, the mythical design that will inspire the sentiment and will give the opportunity to, let's say, develop the new care, the new, let's say, stimuli and the energy to search for the empathy and the integration with the environment. And the metaphysical design, we see that with the bio design, there is the opportunity also to redefine an aesthetic of the environment, which is can take also the role of art and poetic aesthetic into our life. So a richness, more than a richness for, let's say, food for thoughts, for the continuation of the activity that is in our mind. Rayon, you can share the presentation with Sabrina and
sure.
Carmen.
I would only ask, like, if you use it only in your group, but not share it sort of like outside the group, I would be happy.
Okay, only for the people involved in the workshop.
Yeah,
yes,
please ask them
yes.
not to share it around.
Because I think it's important to have it, to give the opportunity to deepen into the presentation and for the participants, because it helps to create the mindset out of which we can further think about the further step.
And I'm sorry, it's clear that we already have all the ingredients for a better life. Now we have the nature, we have all the ingredients. Unfortunately, however, we still live in a model between the parasistic and the commensalistic, and that we need to get to the modalistic approach. It's not simple. We need a paradigm shift.
Absolutely.
In this framework, thinking of nature as a co-worker can also be considered wrong. I don't know, but
it is a co-worker. But the thing is, like, we should not think of like us and nature as the other.
Yes.
I think that the biggest challenge that we have is to feel, and this is like the metaphysical challenge, that we feel we are not, there's this concept that's described also by Buddhism called interbeing. I'm not a being in myself, I'm an interbeing, and everything is interbeing because everything is connected, you know? Yeah. To cultivate that feeling of feeling connected, feeling part of, I think also for me, that is the basis, if we design the basis of meaning. Because I mentioned before that we have this sort of like, this vacuum of meaning. And for me, meaning is a lack of connection. You know, the moment you feel really connected to something bigger, you feel part of something bigger, your life has a different meaning, you know. And I think, you know, this crisis of meaning, you know, if you speak to indigenous tribes, they don't have a crisis of meaning, you know. They are connected to each other, they are connected to the environment. That in itself is a meaningful existence. We have created this vacuum of meaning because we have replaced that with a pursuit of like material gain. So I think, you know, taking design as a way to reestablish that connection as a form of meaning, I think is an important step.
Yes, we must try to not to end up like the wolf. So I don't know, but perhaps a possible answer could be that of the right measure. I don't know. The only answer that comes that I have now, which is the most banal, obviously, is to find a balance between technological progress and primordial nature. That's why the workshop in May will be important, because so we can try together to imagine possible answer, or probably we can generate new questions. So it's very important for us.
Yeah. But are you thinking of like, or recognizing that, you know, the problem is like, even with these like interesting new organic technologies that are emerging, it's not accessible to people in industry or to people to use, you know. So I think how do we create sort of like platforms with a combination of like universities, political input, companies, to start to create like shareable platforms that helps us to shift our entire industrial or technology based towards sort of like integrated materials. I think that is a huge challenge, I think, that we have to undertake eventually.
I agree.
There is the need actually to reframe what is our reality.
Yeah, it cannot just be recycling, you know.
No, it's and again we have. It is important that we can create some experimentation, some examples that can be used for a better understanding of the challenge we face, the opportunity that we can capture, and indeed to look at the way to reframe solutions, but thinking also about the unwanted impact, the negative side of what we are doing, because also the previous development was intended with an idea of a benign future, and unfortunately we learned today that it was not that. But we have been living until now into the anthropocentric thinking that was right, and we have to prove that there is another way. But it's so complex that we don't have to be scared by the complexity, and we have to try to, let's say, capture those areas where we can have the opportunity to give examples, explain and show that is reframing and it's possible. So how it is going to look the city, or how is going to look part of the cities where actually islands of these ecosystems can be created as examples of an environment, an ecosystem that can grow, but it can give, let's say, example of how it can be. So we have to reduce the complexity somehow in a manageable way to be able to spread the message, to show how this can represent an opportunity for society and that is viable, and have to be done in a way that it doesn't appear of an unsurmountable complexity that is going to frustrate all the stakeholders because it is too big. So we have to chop it somehow in a way that it can be taken step after step toward the opportunity to reach the ability to reframe indeed the future. And many areas are really of interest of also current reality. Materials is so fundamental. So material is absolutely one area where there is the opportunity to further work.
Stefano, what do you think about it? Because for me, a big stumbling block is also, and this is also why it's difficult to involve corporations, is they have the tendency to want to own and patent everything, and with a view to then scale things up. And I think, if you look at the principle of nature that doesn't take one successful species and it puts it everywhere. It takes lower level building blocks and it shares it, like pieces of DNA. Viruses are actually shuttles. The environment cannot exist without viruses, because viruses take pieces of DNA from one organism to another. It shuttles things around. So you have low level building blocks that you share. And in a particular context, that building block is configured in something that is really fitting that context. So I think to create a network whereby we share certain base principles and we can share certain sort of like building blocks that is reconfigured in a local way. I think maybe that is the way to actually start these fires everywhere, rather than trying to find a way to scale it through politics and make one big thing. So that's just a thought.
For sure, there was the intention also to engage with the industry, and that might actually have the interest to participate and also open up a discovery that can represent also the future of the opportunities. Of course, as we said, there is not yet a common understanding of what the future will be and what is the desired future. So there is a path of developing step by step, convincing, educating, creating the examples that can be helped to understand, and to understand that there are opportunities that can make our life as ecosystem much better than what it has been so far. And in a sense, growth intended as it used to be intended so far, technology growth and scaling up and so, might be a paradox of the idea of sustainability. And therefore we have to make sure that we can dedicate with the relatively small resources, energy that we have to address a major topic like this. We have to focus on creating some relevant content that can be of example of what is possible, and how we also want to do it by trying to mitigate the risk of the unwanted impact. Because whatever has been created before by the one that we're thinking about the benefit was not intended to be bad.
Yeah.
It turned to be bad because we didn't actually spend enough time to understand what the possible unwanted impact was on the ecosystem. And because we didn't anticipate on the dark side of humanity that has a different view about what the future has to be, and definitely not a future of a community, but a future that tend to prevail individuals on top of others. And also this, I think, is a different, is another challenge that we have to adopt to make sure that we can indeed create an economy of the way in which we are going to use our resources. Because to use it as we are using them today to fix the problem, it doesn't really help to focus there where we have the opportunity to create the new future. Sabrina, are we going to still have some time to...
Yes, before leaving the floor to Carmen, I would like to ask if someone wants to say something. And also in Italian, don't worry, we can translate for you, please. We have a lot of PhD students online, so I hope that they have some questions for us, for you. If you prefer, you can put in the chat your question. And okay, so Carmen, can you show us the other appointment? And then if you want, if someone wants to add your question on chat, we are glad.
Yes, I don't know if Gabriela wants to... Oh, okay, sorry. So I will share a scheme of the planification of the workshop. So you can see my screen.
It's okay, yeah?
Okay, so first of all, we have one moment. Okay. As we have said, the workshop continues the research activity that we have started in October with the conference. and in which multidisciplinary experts were involved in a critical roundtable on biorevolution issues. And so we have selected some of these issues from the roundtable and aligned also what we have to present it today. And in the next few days, we will send you a document that summarizes these issues in points, so you can understand better and get at the heart of the workshop. We will explain, for example, what we mean by systemic change, strategic reflection, anthropocentrism, preventive sustainability, terrestrial innovation, and so on. However, for those who want to learn more about this lecture and the previous one, you can find the streaming recording on the YouTube channel of Sapienza. The workshop will involve multiple Sapienza PhD, so will include participants in different disciplines, from automation to bioengineering, genetics, industrial management, design, urban planning, and so on. In the first phase, you will proceed autonomously, and I'm going to show you how. While in the second co-design step, you will divide into interdisciplinary groups and work together. In the first part, in the autonomous part, you will be introduced in sociocultural and technological challenges to independent lectures, independent documents that will send you by email. In particular, toward the end of April, we will send you a document on the sociocultural trends of the near future. In particular, we will refer to Gaia challenges raised by the new post-antropocentric vision, and that we have seen also today. We will discuss also how to rebuild the links between the lost links between man and nature, technology and ecology. We will divide them into 4 categories: body, house, city, and world, and there will be the same filters used successively to separate the working groups. In the first half of May, we will send you another independent lecture concerning the technological trends. We'll analyze some macro trends in the 3 physical, digital, and biological dimensions, and how they are nourishing a biorevolution, and that is shaping our way of producing things, taking care of ourselves, or nourishing ourselves, business models, and value chains. So we will select some research carried out in Sapienza, and we will invite the principal investigators to explain them in a short lecture online for great concreteness, and because these researches can be starting point for subsequent concepts. So successively, the on-site co-design workshop will take place at Saperian Co from 16th to 20th of May, and Saperi has a co-working area and a fab lab to support your project's development. And during this week, we have also Stefano Marzano Architetto will also attend, so we will meet them in presence. The workshop will be subdivided into 3 main activities, and it as an exercise to imagine the desirable utopias and the corresponding dystopias on which to reflect for developing anticipating strategies and solutions for risk mitigation. In particular, in the first part, each group will focus on the previous categories, so body, house, city, and world, and will imagine scenarios, concepts, and of product, services, systems, and the use and the benefit of the technologies. We will refer to the convergence of the several technologies in the 3 physical, digital, and biological dimension, and to the increasingly close and necessary relationship between man, nature, and artifice. The second part will be a critical evaluation of the scenarios. Therefore, you will be stimulated to imagine the dystopias and the undesirable consequences of each technology. In the third part, we will start from the benefits and the dystopias identified, and we will develop a strategy to mitigate the risk contained in the solution presented, and align them with the ecosystem functioning. Finally, in June, after some time in which you have the opportunity to develop more your concept, we will discuss the results in a second roundtable online, in which expert, business, and policymakers will be invited to reflect on preventive sustainability and biorevolution opportunities and risks, and as for October event, and this time starting from tangible solution that will be your proposals. We hope you enjoy, and that it will be an opportunity of growth for all of us. In the next days, we will send you the first email with the framework document with the principal issues, and with more specifics about the next steps. So I have concluded. So I thank you both of our speakers. Ron, it's a real pleasure to meet you. And Stefano, special thanks to Stefano, because he's supporting us for some time in these activities. And so thank you to both of you. If you have a question, obviously, you can write in chat or ask in Italian whenever you want.
Okay. All is clear. No, Gabriela wants to. No, I understand.
No, I was thinking about, I'm Paraguayan. I'm taking a PhD here in Italy, but I'm from Paraguay. That is a country that has already 28 linguistical families that doesn't speak Spanish and that haven't yet almost never crossed with the European people. And for me, this, research develops are very important could help to the identity, you know, the identity of sorry, because I'm very much into Italian now. I can speak very well English, but are very important for them as you know, come un baluarte, as a value, you know. I think it's very important. So I'm so happy. I'm so happy to see that point of view. Just
well, I think this is very interesting, and indeed we have to leverage also on the participation of the international students in order to also bring perspectives that are not necessarily the one from which we come from. And I think this is very, very interesting. Yeah. Lovely. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well,
looking forward for the workshop following.
Yeah. Well, we all are very, very happy and very satisfied that we have initiated something, feeling that it was good to do it, and it's like an organism now that it starts to grow and to further develop, and we can get the opportunity to grow it for the good, and to engage, stimulate, ignite people and participants and stakeholders to get interested in taking also an active role in working for a desirable future. And we will see which one it will be, but if we provide input and stimuli to somehow direct the future towards the ecosystem, probably we will indeed turn in a much better society, and in a world that will be reframed and will regain the idea of paradise.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Concludo in italiano così come ho iniziato. Vi ringrazio Reon. Thank you, Brown. Grazie veramente, Stefano. Preziosissimo il tuo stimolo a farci riflettere continuamente. Grazie a Carmen e grazie a voi tutti che avete seguito. Erano 192 persone collegate costantemente, più il canale YouTube, per cui insomma siamo contenti e speriamo veramente di avervi dato qualche punto di riflessione in più. Grazie, ci vediamo presto. We'll see in Rome.
Bye bye.
Grazie.
Bye bye.
Ciao,
Ciao, grazie a tutti.
Ciao a tutti.